121 seconds. That is all it took to destroy the safest passenger jet ever built. 30 years without a single fatal crash. Erased in the time it takes to boil an egg.
The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a promise. Cross the Atlantic in 3.5 hours, fly at twice the speed of sound, sip champagne at the edge of space.
For over 3 decades, it flew the world's wealthiest passengers between Paris, London, and New York without a single fatal accident.
Then, on July 25, 2000, a Concorde lined up on runway 26 right at Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris. 100 passengers on board, mostly German tourists on their way to a cruise ship in New York. 6 cabin crew, 3 of the most experienced pilots in the world. Everything was routine. Everything was normal. Everything was about to end. But here is what the investigation would eventually reveal. The Concorde was not brought down by a design flaw. It was not brought down by pilot error. It was brought down by a piece of metal only 43 centimeters long. And by the time anyone realized it, it was already too late. To understand what happened, you have to understand what makes the Concorde different from every other passenger jet. The delta wing that made it so beautiful also forced it to take off much faster than a normal aircraft. A Boeing 737 lifts off at around 145 knots. The Concorde needed 200. That speed put enormous stress on the tires. In its 30 years of flight, the Concorde had burst 57 tires. 12 of them caused structural damage. 6 had punctured the wing tanks. Aviation authorities had known about this problem since 1979. They evaluated the risk of fire and concluded that a small fuel leak would not lead to a catastrophic disaster. They were about to be proven catastrophically wrong. Just 4 minutes before the Concorde was cleared for takeoff, a different aircraft rolled down the same runway. A Continental Airlines DC-10 headed to Newark. During its takeoff roll, a small piece of metal fell off the right engine and landed on the runway. 43 centimeters of titanium. No warning in the cockpit. No indication anything was wrong. The DC-10 continued to Newark. At the time, France required only 2 runway inspections per day. There was no time to catch what had just happened. And then the Concorde started rolling. At exactly 14:42:30 UTC, the captain pushed the 4 thrust levers forward. 4 Olympus engines roared to full power. Full afterburners engaged. The aircraft began accelerating down the runway. 24 seconds in, the first officer called out 100. The flight engineer confirmed 4 greens. 30 seconds in, V1 was called. The takeoff was now unstoppable. 39 seconds in, at exactly 1,700 meters down the runway, the left main landing gear rolled directly over the metal strip left behind by the DC-10. Half a second later, one of the tires exploded. Pieces of that tire, some weighing over 4 kilograms, were thrown upward against the underside of the left wing. They hit fuel tank number 5, full of jet fuel. The tank buckled inward from the impact. The pressure wave had nowhere to go, and the tank ruptured from the inside. Dozens of liters of fuel began gushing out under the wing. Electrical wiring in the landing gear strut was cut by the explosion. The wires arced, and behind the still extended landing gear, a pocket of turbulent air held a flame in place, feeding it, growing it, sustaining it. The Concorde was now on fire before it had even left the ground. And this is where the pilots faced an impossible choice. The aircraft was past V1. Rejecting the takeoff at this speed would send the burning Concorde off the end of the runway. Continuing meant flying an aircraft they knew was damaged, in a way no pilot had ever been trained for. The captain chose to fly. In the cockpit, the first officer called out, "Watch out." Half a second later, the flight engineer called the same thing. "Watch out." Both engines on the left side were choking on hot gases and rubber debris. Engine 1 was starting to recover. Engine 2 was dying. The aircraft was yawing hard left. The captain was fighting it with full right rudder.
At only 187 knots, well below the safe rotation speed, the captain pulled back on the controls anyway. He had no choice. He had run out of runway.
The Concorde lifted off, and then a new voice entered the cockpit. Air traffic control, watching from the tower, watching the flames. Air France 4590, you have flames. You have flames trailing behind. The first officer acknowledged. The flight engineer started the engine fire procedure on number 2. The fire alarm briefly stopped, then came back again. Because the fire was not inside the engine, it was outside, growing, melting through the aluminum of the left wing. The captain gave the order to retract the landing gear. It was their only chance to reduce drag and climb. The first officer tried, and tried, and tried. The gear would not retract. The Concorde had already been dead for 30 seconds. Nobody in the cockpit knew it yet. At 100 feet above the ground, the aircraft was stuck. Speed, 200 knots. Engine out climb speed, 220. They could not climb. They could not accelerate. Every second the fire burned was another second closer to structural failure. The first officer kept calling out, "Speed! Speed!" Then he tried once more to raise the gear. And this time, he said the words that ended this story.
"The gear is not retracting."
Seconds later, the fire began melting through the left inboard elevon. The Concorde started to roll uncontrollably to the left. The captain fought it. The nose pitched up. The angle of attack increased past anything survivable. The first officer called out one last plan.
Le Bourget. Le Bourget. We are going to try for Le Bourget.
They never made it. At 14:44:31, exactly 121 seconds after brake release, the Concorde reached a bank angle of 113 degrees and crashed into a hotel in Gonesse, just west of Charles de Gaulle Airport. All 109 people on board, 4 people in the hotel on the ground. The investigation started the next morning, and it found something that made this tragedy even harder to accept. That 43-centimeter metal strip on the runway had not just fallen off by accident. Investigators traced it back to the maintenance history of the DC-10, and what they found was disturbing. That specific metal strip had been replaced twice in the previous 2 months. It had been drilled 37 times. The manufacturer's instructions called for only 12. It had not been manufactured to the correct specifications. The strip next to it was too long, slowly wearing it down until it fell off.
The Concorde was not killed by bad luck. It was killed by a part that never should have been on that DC-10 in the first place.
Then investigators reviewed every second of the pilot's response, every call-out, every decision, every action. Their conclusion was final. There was nothing the pilots could have done differently.
Once that tire exploded, the aircraft was lost. The fire would have destroyed the flight controls no matter what. The landing gear would never have retracted. The thrust was already gone. Every choice the crew made was the correct choice, and every one of those choices led to the same ending.
The Concorde was grounded within days. Kevlar lining was added to the fuel tanks. New burst-resistant tires were fitted. Electrical wiring was rerouted and protected. 14 months later, the Concorde flew again.
But then September 11th happened. Air travel collapsed. Business travelers stopped flying. And 2 years later, on October 24th, 2003, British Airways landed the last Concorde at Heathrow Airport for the final time. The fastest passenger aircraft ever built retired. Not because of a design flaw, not because of pilot error, because a metal strip that should never have existed fell on a runway at exactly the wrong moment. The greatest achievement in commercial aviation history was ended by 43 centimeters of metal. And to this day, no passenger jet has flown faster than the speed of sound again. If this changed how you see aviation safety, tell me in the comments. Did the pilots make the right call continuing the takeoff?
Or should they have rejected past V1?
Subscribe for more stories about the moments that changed aviation history forever. I will see you in the next one.